Okay, so we're recording. We are
Yep.
recording. Okay. All right. Praise the Lord, you guys. Welcome to the program today. Today on the show, we are going to interview a very special guest and a very dear friend of mine, David Daniels. David Daniels, who works for the world-renowned Chick Publications that sends out literally millions of Bible and gospel tracts all over the world. There are countless stories from people who read a Chick tract and were brought to salvation as a result. I'm sure many people watching this interview can relate to at least one or two people that you've heard a story about who came across a Chick tract and then came to salvation. Praise the Lord. David is an author. He is a Bible researcher and a linguist. He's written at least 16 books from what we found on the website, including two of my personal favorites, Is the World's Oldest Bible a Fake? And Who Faked the World's Oldest Bible? Also another great book, Why They Changed the Bible. That's the book that we interviewed, that I read before we interviewed David. Some of you will remember our film Bridge to Babylon, where David appears in that film as well. And also, he and I have communicated for years over issues pertaining to the Codex Sinaiticus and that whole controversy. And also with that, the Codex Vaticanus, although kind of a secondary issue, but still a very important one, and how they are presented to the Christian community, which is at least part of what we're going to talk about on the show today. David Daniels, welcome to the program, brother.
It is so good to see you.
And you too. You too. All right. Now, I guess the first thing for anybody who might not be familiar with you, you work for Chick Publications. How long have you worked with Chick Publications, and exactly what do you do there?
I have worked at Chick Publications for 21 and a half years, and I was originally hired on as what was called research consultant. But the real job I got was to work with Jack writing tracts. And so for 16 years, we wrote tracts together and comic books. And then as we did this, he was progressively teaching me about writing tracts and assisted me in writing books. It was really cool because he would draw pictures for some of them, like Did the Catholic Church Give Us the Bible and Babylon Religion specifically.
Oh, so you worked there for 21 years. All right. And you write a lot of books, and years ago, when we finished our film Tares Among the Wheat, I sent you a copy. You guys had carried A Lamp in the Dark, which was part one of the series. Part two, Tares Among the Wheat, where we go over this whole controversy in the 19th century with Codex Sinaiticus and the story of Constantine Simonides. In fact, I went ahead and broke out this book. I'm sure you remember this.
Yep.
Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides affair. What did we pay for these? Like $75?
$75.
$75 to get a copy of this. And it had to be sent over from some Greek island somewhere, because they're not easy to find. And I told you that's kind of what I used, not all, but as kind of a foundation, because the author, even though J.K. Elliott does not agree with our view, he still writes a very simple book where he's laying out one step at a time the news articles that were published at the time that most people knew nothing about. And at least I feel like I never heard anything about this. And then I stumbled on it in the research. Now, when you saw Tares Among the Wheat, originally, you were very skeptical of the story and the claims of Simonides. But then over time, you changed your view, didn't you? And you've written 2 books.
Yes. Well, I blame you. I called you one day. I remember when I'd already been doing the videos, something funny about Sinaiticus. And even then, after doing that and putting those together into Is the World's Oldest Bible a Fake, I ended up thinking still that Simonides still had to be a con man. He had to be a forger. And then I started realizing, well, wait a second. I've not even given him the benefit of the doubt. I gave Tischendorf the benefit of the doubt and wrote a whole book giving him the benefit of the doubt and working my way through it and finding out, okay, no, he's a liar and a thief and a cad. But then about Simonides, I had to find out, okay, how do I find out if he is telling the truth? Okay, I think he's lying, but how do I find out? Take apart his testimony. And as I did that, I finally gave you a call one day. Remember, I was doing the walk around the building. I got on the phone. I said, hey, Chris, this is David. You're wrong. You're right. I'm wrong. Any questions? And I said, you're completely right about Simonides. I was wrong. Completely. And you told me at that point, you said, David, I was just trying to get a movie together. And all I wanted to do was settle the issue, show where the guy's wrong, and then put that in the movie and be done with it. But I couldn't find where he was wrong. And so we both agreed with each other. No matter, whenever we picked one thing to drill in on, where we had evidence to look at, and we drilled in, the bottom wasn't an onion. It wasn't an empty hole. The bottom was, oh, dude, he's telling the truth. And then we'd find cross references from even rare and obscure books and then maps and all sorts of cultural things, and every little detail. I could not find where he was telling a lie in this basic narrative.
No, that's exactly what happened to me. I thought when I first made Tares Among the Wheat, I assumed that what you generally read about Simonides was true, that he was a forger, and somehow or other he was lying about Codex Sinaiticus, claiming that he was the real author shortly after Tischendorf. For those who don't know and who haven't seen, the film and whatnot, just so they know, Codex Sinaiticus is called the world's oldest Bible. And Tischendorf discovered the first 43 leaves back in 1844. He brought them back, published them kind of, quietly, called them Codex Frederico Augustinus, that's it. And then years later goes back. He takes a second trip there. He finds a fragment. And then he takes his third trip there in 1859, and that's where he finds the main body, the complete copy of the New Testament, plus the Shepherd of Hermas, Epistle of Barnabas, and then the rest of the Old Testament that he had left behind. And that's what is called Codex Sinaiticus. And he discovers this quote unquote discovers it in 1859, brings it back, publishes it. And then within a short period of time, we have this Greek paleographer named Constantine Simonides. He shows up and he says, wait a minute, this is not the world's oldest Bible. This is a manuscript that I created back in 1840 on Mount Athos, and it was intended to be a gift to the Tsar of Russia. And Tischendorf has misidentified it. And then that led to this controversy that went on for about 4 years, privately and in the newspapers, and the debate went on. Everybody ultimately agreed. Well, I wouldn't say everybody, but most people agreed with Tischendorf because he was the main guy. But Simonides went to his grave maintaining that he was the true author of the Codex. And then, as I point out, in 1907, you have James Farrar. And Farrar, from what I understand, had communicated with J.E. Hodgkin, who was the friend of Simonides. And Hodgkin continued to believe that Simonides may have been telling the truth and that the whole issue should be investigated, and it was never properly settled. And that's the argument that Farrar makes in 1907 in his book, Literary Forgeries. And Farrar was a barrister. He was a lawyer. So he knew how things are to be argued in a court of law. You see what I'm saying? And so he analyzes this whole thing. He looks at all the evidence in favor of Simonides, and he says it's unfortunate that the matter was never resolved at the time the claim was made. And then he goes on to say that it must be considered one of the interesting but unsolved mysteries of literature. And that's what really struck me when I was doing the original research. I thought, wait a minute, there were people like, and Farrar, his book, Literary Forgeries, is called a classic work by Bruce Metzger. So it's not like he's just some hack. he was a very serious researcher, and he understood about evidence and presenting a case in a court of law and that kind of thing. And he calls it an unsolved mystery. Well, why is it that nobody's talking about this? Why is nobody pointing out the fact that the issue of whether or not Codex Sinaiticus is genuine was never resolved? Why are we being told that there's no question, this is the world's oldest Bible, and now we need to make all these changes to the traditional text of the scripture? You see what I'm saying?
Exactly. What's interesting, and what became who faked the world oldest Bible is, as I started discovering, after that phone call and I continued looking, how do you give somebody the benefit of the doubt? Well, you start by finding out, just like I did with Tischendorf, what was Simonides' testimony. And I took it apart, word, phrase, verse. I literally put it up, got it on the board. I wrote 4 levels of things that I would see as what levels of genuineness possible that I there, and what levels of certainty I have about those things being historically true or not. And I wrote these principles up on the whiteboard right behind your screen over here. And when I set those principles, I went, okay, now I'm being fair. And as I did that, I started taking apart every bit of it. And the first thing is, what's a Cadonia? Where's Cadonia? And then I found this 1920s thing that said it was destroyed. I thought, oh, that's the end of that. And then one day I come in and it's always through prayer. And the Lord just says, look again. And then boom, what? It's Ivalic. It's still there. It's not gone. And I start finding this history, start finding about it's a very specific town with a specific history. It's got a Greek history in the midst of a Muslim country in Turkey. It had no Muslims in the city. Suddenly something happened, the Greek Revolution. Suddenly all this history starts coming together, and every single word, including where Simonides' great uncle, Benedict, is there as a teacher named Vissarion of Cyme, Cyme being a little island off of Rhodes and off of Turkey. So it's north of Rhodes and west of Turkey. And then finding all this information from the small little sentence that was just blurted out by Simonides. He just wrote it out in a letter, got it out, and this information is absolutely 100% in every way correct. But there was no way to know it back in the 1800s because people didn't have fast access to the internet. They couldn't find out the history of cities and places. They didn't have people who did photographs around the world and deep level maps and everything. All the internet gave me was the stuff that Farrar couldn't do. I had access to documents he'd never seen. I got to find Masonic documents and the histories of the place. I got to find the stuff from the Orthodox Church and the different factions of the Orthodox Church, the Russians and the Russian military and what their documents were. And that was the great thing. At the very end, while George Collins, president of CHIC, has been with Jack since 1968, and I were working on the editing of toward the end of this book, suddenly I realized that there was a document missing that I should have been looking at. And I had it, but it wasn't in my OCR system. It wasn't in my search system. So I found the document, and then I found an online document and was able to OCR it and search it. And that led me to a treasure trove of Russian documents. The Russian documents, fortunately, had Russian on this side and English on this side. And as I went through, and then other parts had Greek and English. And as I went through those documents, it backed up everything I had thought and added even more information and gave a new perspective from the Russians, which is all in this book. Again, validating the same premise about what Tischendorf was really about, what was really happening with the Sinaiticus, the tricks and and all the political machinations that were happening between Cairo and the monks there and St. Catherine's down in the Egyptian peninsula and things that were going on there. And then finding out by searching the history of the patriarchs, the heads of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the various levels of that, and archbishops, I started to be able to, or archimandrites, I started to be able to look around and find the people whom Simonides mentioned in passing and other people, and then found out that the whole thing was legitimate, it's historical, and it fits in a very specific timeline, which I included in massive detail in the back.
Well, that was my discovery as well. In general, that if you follow, because like you said, and as I told you way back years ago, you start trying to prove Simonides wrong, and then you keep running up against these roadblocks. Like, well, wait a minute, he's not wrong here.
Roadblocks of truth. Yeah.
Yeah, they're saying that he that Tischendorf exposed his forgery, the Shepherd of Hermas. Then you find out that's not a forgery. Well, why aren't? Wait a minute, why aren't they telling us it's not a forgery? Oh, Tischendorf changed his mind. Well, why did he change his mind? Oh, because he found a matching copy as part of Codex Sinaiticus. What? You know what?
Yeah,
And
that
so
wasn't made public, was it?
yeah, it was made public, but they never talked about it in the newspapers.
Well,
I mean,
that's what I mean.
Scrivener.
There was a lot of that what I call conspiracy, a conspiracy of scholarship. They literally decide what they want in print and what they don't want in print, and all the stuff that doesn't follow their narrative, they left out of print. There were books written on it, of course.
Well, they didn't include it in the newspapers, which I thought was very bizarre. And the fact that, I mean, what's his name? Scrivener he mentions it in his full collation of Codex Sinaiticus. He mentions the fact. We find James Donaldson mentioning it in his Apostolic Fathers.
Exactly.
He talks about it. And then Philip Schaff mentions it in his History of the Christian Church. He just briefly, very, very brief mention that Tischendorf retracted his former objections in 1863. But there's no mention of the fact that that same year, 1863, Simonides had challenged Tischendorf to a public debate on the whole issue of Codex Sinaiticus in London, right there. He says, okay, bring the manuscript. I'll go meet you in front of all the scholars in London, and I'm going to prove that I'm the guy who really wrote this codex. And then at one point, it appears Tischendorf agreed, because Simonides wrote a letter to the newspaper and says that the public were assured that Tischendorf was going to show up, but now the date has come and gone and he's nowhere to be found, and he calls him out on it. Mm-hmm. But what's happening that same year, that's the same year that Tischendorf is saying he's changing his view. He's admitting that he had called Simonides' Shepherd of Hermas a forgery back in 1856. Now he's changing his mind.
He's affirming his former view.
Exactly.
He's not saying he was wrong. He's affirming his former view.
There you go. I mean, I found the whole thing, like all these twists and turns, and I'm like, why are the newspaper editors so bent on sabotaging Simonides? It was almost like fake news media from the 19th century or something.
Oh yeah. Well, it was. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really believe that's what it was, that there was an ultimate development, which I talk about in the book, of course. There's a move for one world Bible, for one world religion. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, the problem was everybody, well, you're the one who pointed out Hogg, the priest, Hugg, J.L. Hugg, not Hogg. Sorry, yeah. I'm thinking about modern politics. Hugg, the priest, and his pushing for an early date for Codex Vaticanus. And when he did that, the problem was the reception by the scholars was it's only one. It's by itself. You know, Graham Penn, the great-grandson of the founder of Pennsylvania, he's writing in his book, it's only one. It's not complete. You need to have something else. There was an open hole. And remember, when you're looking for a con or a swindle, look for somebody who presents something right at the time when they're looking for it. Somebody says, oh, look at this discovery. And the discovery happens right at the moment when it's needed. Mm-hmm. That's what Sinaiticus turned out to be. So as soon as the Jesuits, I believe, figured out, again, that's part of my theory. I have the few parts that are my theory in there and the rest is fact. But I believe when a Jesuit figured out that this manuscript was something that they could use, and it was going unaccompanied by Simonides back to St. Catherine's, that it was open for Tischendorf, who'd been waiting for extra weeks over in Rome across the bay, go across the water to the other side to Rome, Tischendorf has been sitting there simultaneously waiting for the Pope to talk to him. All of a sudden, after this book is gone and the information has gotten to the Pope, I believe through Cardinal Meyer or whatever, then he suddenly has an audience. This guy who killed Christians, this guy who is very, very persecutorial, suddenly welcomes in Tischendorf himself and has this conversation and says something. And Tischendorf zips his lip at that point.
What you're talking about when he's meeting with the Pope?
1843. 1843. Yes. Right when Simonides, according to what I say in my theory, that he finished, well, according to his own stuff, according to his own published book, he finished Barnabas, and then he finally realizes he does not want to change what the people in Sinai or St. Catherine's want him to do and change this edited book back to an ordinary Greek book instead of the plan of his own great uncle, which was all the changes that he had been making in it to accord with the Gnostic kind of beliefs that they were teaching, and Masonic beliefs that they were teaching in Cadonia. So when he turns this thing off and says, I don't want anything to do with this, he nonetheless takes his manuscript, because he's got his 8 different total copies, seven plus the one he copied off of the change in Sinaiticus. He's got that written into his own little Barnabas book, which you sent me, by the way, and it was so awesome to finally translate with the help of my son. That when he got that, he was dismissive and didn't want to do anything with that book anymore, because he didn't want to be held responsible for betraying his great uncle. At that point that the book went off by itself, now Simonides has got his Barnabas thing, and he wants to get that published. So he's got to go over to Smyrna and go to the Rhodokanakis family and get them to their printing press to print this thing up and everything. I think at that point the Jesuits have gone back to Rome, told either the Jesuit or the Jesuit and the Pope, there's this other manuscript that can work into your plan to get them to go for Vaticanus. And so that point, the Pope then says to Tischendorf, there's a book. You want to see Vaticanus? I got a deal for you. You go get me that book, or you get that book out to the public, and then that'll satisfy you. Then I'll let you see the Vaticanus. I think that's the way that things actually went in 1843. Well, that's when he suddenly starts raising his money to go down to Egypt.
Okay. Well, here's what I wanted. I want to go back to the point you made about J.L. Hugg and the fact that his dating, because he's the first guy in the year 1810 to date Vaticanus to the 4th century.
Yes.
And I think most ministers, most pastors don't realize that it's only the year 1810 that anybody decided this was a 4th century codex.
Right. And it was by a priest, and it was because of the conquest of Napoleon, and then calling for 500 objects to come from the Vatican, and then having this one guy go out there and select those items and bring them to Paris to make a new nice museum. They wanted to make their own what do they call it? A museum. It was like artifacts around the world and stuff, and they wanted to include 500 things they got from the Vatican that were considered valuable, and they took that, and that's where Hugg sees it. And when he looks at it, whether he comes up with it, who knows who came up with the idea, but he wrote it down definitely in 1810 that it was from the 4th century. And immediately writing it in Latin means that all the scholars, including the Protestants, all taught Latin, would be able to read it. And I think that was done on purpose to get them in on this so that they would start looking for it. Because remember, paleography, as you have pointed out before, was taught by the Catholics first. Yeah. And so the teachers,
they invented it. Here's something I wanted to say, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
Where Vaticanus is concerned, the guy who invented Greek paleography, Bernard de Montfalcon, he had dated prior Vaticanus. He dated it to the 6th century. He placed it 200 years later. You see what I'm saying?
And it has Latinisms in it. It's got Latin in the text. And that was part of the conversation that Erasmus, who gave us the received text, as it were, and gave the Greek text that went to Martin Luther, that went into Wittenberg, and he read it and realized the just shall live by faith as he read it right there in Greek and Latin in that parallel thing that Erasmus did. When Erasmus, never having seen the Vaticanus, spoke to the librarian, or they wrote back and forth in letters, he sent him 365 scriptures to show him how the Latin Vulgate is in accord with this. And what Erasmus took from it was that, as you know, that he thought it had been, that he didn't know it wasn't ancient, but that he thought that it had been modified because of the Council of Florence, right? In the 1430s to 40s.
That it was cooked up. It was either invented in the 1430s by the Council of Florence, or maybe it was an older codex that they modified.
And it was modified in order to accord with it because it had these Latinisms, and the Latinisms don't match something from ancient Egypt.
Right. One other thing I wanted to point out with you talking about this and what was said about it being singular, being only one, and it needs to have support.
Right.
J. Neville Birdsall, Professor J. Neville Birdsall, who was considered an expert on Codex Vaticanus, and he worked with people like Bruce Metzger, so he's one of their guys. Okay. And Birdsall, there's a book called The Bible as Book, where it's like a symposium at the British Library, and I want to say 1999 or thereabout. And he gave a presentation on Codex Vaticanus, and he says two things. One, that Vaticanus had no impact at all on New Testament scholarship at all until 1859 with the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus.
Exactly. It was alone.
See what I'm saying?
It's exactly what Graham Penn was saying. The same thing. The whole idea that it being alone, it had no secondary testimony. And that's what's so funny about it, because they really disagree with each other, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, all over the place.
In many places.
But they do agree to disagree with the received text, with the one that people died to preserve. And so that gave them something that they could work by. And then, of course, that led ultimately to the Westcott and Hort theory, taking Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and if they do agree, that's original. And then working from that, which never has been left, despite every professor I've ever had saying that they don't do that anymore. Yes, they do. They still do. They just supplement it with the papyri, which are of questionable origin themselves, since you pointed out where the Bodmer and Beatty papyri were found. Why don't you say that? Why don't you tell them? Tell them where the Bodmer and Beatty papyri all come from.
They all come from Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Nag Hammadi, Egypt, most of them anyway, because the collections are vast, but they come from the same collection. The same region in Nag Hammadi, found right near a Gnostic library. And all of those papyri went through the hands of a Jesuit priest named Father Luis Dutrelo. I mean, you can't make this up. You just cannot make it up. You've got a Jesuit priest over there, and he's working with this antiquities dealer, a guy named Tanno. And this guy Tanno is going out and finding materials, and he's working with some mysterious guy that they call the Bey of Papyri. The name Bey means like chief, but nobody knows who he is. And they're getting these papyri and bringing them to Dutrelo, the Jesuit, and he's examining them, and he's saying, okay, this is good, this is genuine, this is not genuine, etc. And he's making these decisions. He's the guy saying, this is a genuine ancient papyri, this is not, or whatever. But it's all going through the hands of a Jesuit. You see what I'm saying? And he's the one making the determinations. And that's where they're getting P66, P75, these papyri that they use to supplement Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But they were found right next to a Gnostic library.
And graveyard.
Yes.
You got to point out the graveyard too. It's a Gnostic.
And that book, by the way, hold that up again, David, for people to see. That if anybody wants to study the papyri, because I asked a number of people, I asked James White when I interviewed him, where do the papyri come from? And nobody has any answers. If you want to know where the papyri that they're using comes from, get this book by James Robinson, The Story of the Bodmer Papyri. He's the guy who went and actually got all the details on this. That's the incredible thing.
And he didn't make it easy to find.
No.
You have to really, I have highlights, little bits and little lines here and there where I kind of pull it together and then back and forth going through the index and stuff, but you can find it if you take the time.
Yeah.
Look up the names and follow those people every place they appear, and then follow the Elephantine 1 and 2 and all that stuff they talk about.
All right. I wanted to throw one more thing out there just to follow up on J. Neville Birdsall and to reinforce a point that on Vaticanus that you made about it being by itself. Birdsall also says in that symposium, I've got it highlighted in the book, that despite the best scholarship in the world, there is absolutely no historic evidence to place Vaticanus outside the 15th century.
It's a very important point. And again, because we talk about provenance, the proof of an origin of something. And the way you do that is that you have other things that you can clearly date to that time and people or whatever testimony that says that this is that. And that evidence that what you have then is what you have now. That's the other thing. Chain of custody is the next thing. You need, once you know the origin of something, you have plain testimony that it was there, that testimony as to what was in it, that it matches what you have now. But then you have to have now a chain of custody to show that what you have now is the same thing, not unchanged from when it was then. It was like the OJ trial. You know, do you have the same glove? Is it untouched by anything? Was it put inside a bag and then passed down to you without anything extra added to it? You know, that's the idea. Forensic evidence, it's great. What is admissible in a court of law? You have to have first provenance, proof of where it came from, evidenced by other testimony, and then you have to have chain of custody, and then you have to have validation of its date, which is what chemical testing is for. And of course, we have this with Sinaiticus and Vaticanus,
right.
A big zero.
Well, I want to say this, and I'm going to make like a short video, and I'm going to put this in there just so people can have it. Maybe I'll try and insert it in this video.
Sure.
But when I was part of what made me question the dating of Vaticanus years ago, because I never thought twice about it, David. Never just assumed that.
By the way, send me that article of Neville Birdsall. I don't think I have it.
Oh, I'll take a picture of the pages and I'll send them over.
Yeah.
Because I think you definitely want those quotes. Those are great quotes.
Yes. Oh yeah.
But when I was at the British Library working on Lamp in the Dark years ago, and I got to interview Dr. Scott McKendrick, who's the head of Western manuscripts there.
Yes.
And he was in charge of the whole Codex Sinaiticus project,
right,
where they scanned all those pages into the internet. We were actually there interviewing him and another guy named Dr. Juan Garces. These are the guys that you'll see on the BBC or pretty much anywhere where they talk about Codex Sinaiticus. And at one point I asked him about Vaticanus. I said, can you tell us about Codex Vaticanus? And he said, sure. And what he said was, he says, of course, when you first see Codex Vaticanus, he says, of course, you're told that this is a 4th century manuscript. And then he says, but it doesn't look at all like a 4th century manuscript. It looks very much like a 15th century manuscript. That's what he said. And I'm sitting there holding the camera, right, listening to him, and I'm going, it doesn't look like it. Well, then how do you know it is? You know what I mean?
You didn't, did you say that? Did you ask him?
No, I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking. And
but at
I
least
thought,
you got him saying it. You got him on camera.
Oh yeah.
I've never seen, so you haven't put this out publicly before.
It's at the end of A Lamp in the Dark. It's in the last 20 minutes of A Lamp in the Dark.
You got to turn it back around. You got to bring it back out again because I didn't realize
that's what made me, because he said, it's almost like Darwinism, where they say, well, of course you're told that the dinosaur bones are millions and billions of years old. That's what you're told. And so that's what you end up believing. And I thought, well, wait a minute. the way he's saying that, you know, just immediately made me suspicious. It made me begin to question, okay, well, how do they know? And that led me into this whole dating thing and uncovering paleography, you know, and okay, how do they make these paleography, handwriting analysis? Well, where does that come from? And then we get into that, as you know, and you've talked about
Babillon
this.
Montfaucon. Uh-huh.